Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Brown Bag Lunch sponsored by the Teachers Thematic Group and the Education Global Practice. My name is Cristiana Edo. I'm the Manager for Education for South Asia, and then I'll be chairing today's session. First of all, let me just thank the speakers and introduce them to you for taking the time to be here with us to present this very important research and very relevant research for us. First, we have Professor Jim Wicock. He's a Curry Memorial Professor of Education, Professor of Public Policy, and Director of Ed Policy Works at the University of Virginia. Welcome, sir. And then we also have Scott Thompson, who is the Deputy Chief for Innovation and School Design of the District of Columbia Public Schools. Welcome. Today we are going to be discussing a very important evaluation and program, an evaluation of the program, which is the IMPACT program, which was launched in the year 2009, if I recall, and through which all teachers in the districts are evaluated against a very strict rubric. And this is a very high stake evaluation that some consequences of that is low performer teachers under some rules might be dismissed, but also got a very important financial recognition in case the performance is good. Has been controversial, but for the time being has survived to the benefit of the students. This evaluation that we are going to be discussing today is a joint effort between the University of Virginia, Stanford, and the District of Columbia Public Schools. Uses about data from 10 years, 45,000 students, and 3,500 teachers. So it's really comprehensive. And just to put it in a framework, we just had the WB World Development Report on learning to realize education promise. And one of the three messages are assessing learning and put learning as the core. Second, act on evidence. So I think that we are very curious to learn more about this evaluation, because this is the type of evidence that we need to be not only learning from, but also conveying to our clients all around the world. And the third one is align actors to make the whole system work for education. And this is where also we really like to learn more about how you implemented this very important strategy. So with that said, let me just give the floor to Professor Wicock to get us started with the presentation.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having us. We're Scott and I don't think have ever had an opportunity to present together in this way the work we've been doing for the last 7 years, and so this is a great opportunity. And I guess I'd encourage you all to interrupt us as we go, certainly if anything's unclear, but you want to take a detour and talk about something in a little more detail. I think we'd be happy to do that, and we'll try and manage the time so that we get to the end of all this.
Maybe I'll interrupt first and ask would it be possible if we can go around and do a quick round of introductions? I'm just curious to get a sense of who's in the room and what your roles are. Okay. If we could just quickly do sort of just name.
So let's start with the Agile.
Jason Weaver in ECA Education.
ECA is Europe and Central Asia.
Shaharm Paksima from the Middle East North Africa education team, doing a little bit of work on the ECA region as well.
I'm Karthika Radhakrishnan. I work in South Asia education, and I work primarily in India on education projects and in Bangladesh.
I'm Dave Evans from the Africa region, and also working with the Teachers Thematic Group here today.
Alonso from Mexico, and I work mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean, a lot on teacher issues, teacher training, teacher coaching. So very glad to hear about this program and be here with you.
Mm-hmm. Manal Gota, an education specialist from the Middle East and North Africa region, and similar to the colleagues here working on a lot of these issues.
Hi, I'm Malshri. I'm working in the East Africa education region on 2 projects. One is in higher education and the other on skills education.
I'm Graham Harrison in the Africa region.
Simon Thacker in the Middle East, North Africa region.
Mary Breeding, I'm a consultant with the Teachers Thematic Group. I'm Xiaoyan Liang. I'm an education specialist in the Africa region now, focusing East Africa mainly on higher education skills and to some extent teachers. But prior to joining the Africa region, I was working in the East Asia regions on a couple of high-performing systems like China and Korea. So I look forward to hearing from your presentation.
Should we go?
I'm Jill Barr, retired from the bank a few years ago.
I'm Huma Kitwai, Education Specialist, East Africa region.
I'm Aisha. I'm working as a summer intern on the Punjab Education Project.
I'm Jeff Tanner, economist doing health, actually, and results-based finance. My work is related to this and trying to get good data in front of decision makers.
We'll let you stay.
Hi, my name is Vince Lampone. I'm an education consultant in Indonesia.
I'm Samra. I'm an education specialist with the Middle East and North Africa region.
Khalil Bakuntar from the Middle East and North Africa education.
I'm Alvin. I'm with the Global Partnership for Education.
I'm Christina Lang. I work in the front office of the Education GP.
I'm Alice. I'm with Global Partnership for Education.
And then finally,
I'm Tara. I work in South Asia in higher education, middle and school education. And with Dave, I'm the co-lead for the Teachers Thematic Group at the World Bank. And with Dave, we also worked on the World Development Report that Christian mentioned.
And then we have...
I'm Lorelei. I'm with the Global Knowledge and Engagement team.
Okay, great. Good idea, Scott. Thank you for that. So we worked with Tara around what parts of the work that we've done over the last 7 years might be most interesting and relevant to you all. And so this is the agenda that we'd like to go through. And since you all live in the DC area, I think maybe we can go quickly through the first part of this, and then Scott will talk a little bit about what reform in DC looked like and how it occurred. We'll talk a little bit Scott will talk about the design details of impact. I'll share a few of the results that we've gotten as a result of analyzing the effects of impact. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about how impact got implemented. And finally, a little bit about the partnership, if we have time, and the way we've worked together over the last 7 years. So for those of you that have lived in this area for a long time, you understand that the District of Columbia's public schools have for a long time been very low performing on a variety of different assessments. This is the NAEP results from 2007, right at the beginning of the time when reform began in DCPS. And using the TUDA data that you're probably familiar with from the NAEP, DC was the lowest performing school district for which they collected data. And you see there, 66% of the kids were below basic on the NAEP result at that point. Yet if you looked at how teachers were assessed at that time, only 8% of the 8th graders were proficient on the NAEP. 95% of the teachers were given the message that they either met or exceeded the expectations of the school district. So those two things could exist. That's possible for that to be occurring. But it does raise some questions about what's happening with teaching in the district, and I think that was one of the fundamental premises of the reform. If you do a little history, you go back easily 40 years prior to the 2007 reforms, and you see a series. I stopped when I'm looking at in 1967. I think you could probably go back longer and find documentation that the district has been very poor performing, dysfunctional. Lots of different words have been used, but this is not a new issue for the District of Columbia Public Schools. So finally, this is just a very quick summary of the attributes of the students and the schools of the District of Columbia. And we're going to get into a lot more detail about many of those aspects. So let me pass this to Scott, who I think can set the stage for what occurred in terms of reform in DCPS.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So this slide just gives us a little bit of history. I'll highlight a couple things here. As Jim mentioned, our current sort of reform trajectory began a little over 10 years ago, in 2007, with the election of Mayor Adrian Fenty, who made as one of his top priorities a campaign to have the school district placed under the direct control of the mayor. Prior to that, as in most jurisdictions, DC public schools have been governed by an elected school board. This legislation eliminated the elected school board. There is now a state board of education, but it's in a purely advisory capacity. It doesn't have direct control over any decisions or very few policies. And so this legislation gave the mayor the power to appoint a school's chancellor, who then had a much broader ranging set of authorities over the schools. He appointed as chancellor Michelle Rhee, and one of her first priorities was to focus on the challenges Jim alluded to around teacher quality. We designed the system over the first couple of years, launched in 2009, that's when I joined DCPS, and so the system now has been underway for almost a decade. One of the things that you'll notice here is that Impact has also survived 2 mayoral transitions. So now they're, which is remarkable and not what we expected, I think, necessarily when we launched this. And then after the first year, the mayor who had spearheaded a lot of this work lost his re-election campaign. And so now this has survived 2 transitions, despite these being somewhat acrimonious campaigns with education at the center, as those of you who live in DC and read the papers know. I mentioned that Michelle Rhee made as one of her top priorities focusing on the issue of teacher quality. Much of the thrust of that work was around Impact, our teacher evaluation system, which we'll be discussing at more length today. But a key undergirding policy that I wanted to be sure to highlight was mutual consent. And this changed the traditional policy in DC public schools, where, like in most jurisdictions, teachers didn't have full control over where they taught, and school principals didn't have full control over which teachers taught in their buildings. Teachers would be assigned to schools. Sometimes there could be a petition process for a teacher to ask to be reassigned, but there was comparatively little control. Teachers were treated sort of like interchangeable parts who could be assigned with, if there were any preferences given, it was purely based on seniority. It's hard to hold school leaders accountable for results in their schools when they have no control over their staffs. It's also not an ideal working situation for teachers who could be transferred from school to school to school. And so one of the first priorities of the administration was to negotiate with the teachers union a new contract in 2010, which provided for what we call mutual consent, which simply means that both the teacher and the principal have to agree. It's how most workplaces in a non-unionized context function. You need to interview for a role at a school. You decide where to interview, the principal decides whether to hire you. So that was a key undergirding policy for Impact. Yeah.
And I'm just curious, is your sense, I know this isn't like a survey of U.S. policy, but are most districts in the U.S., is mutual consent relatively novel, or is that pretty common?
It really varies from state to state, in particular based on whether there are strong unions. Mm-hmm. So in states with strong unions, Jim might be able to speak with us more, places like a lot of states in the north, along the west coast, mutual consent doesn't exist. Okay. Teachers are more likely assigned on the basis of seniority, when they lose their jobs on the basis of seniority. In a lot of states that are right-to-work states in the South, it's more likely to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so in places where you've seen strong reform efforts, so for example, in New York City, when Joel Klein was the chancellor there, one of the first things he did was negotiate with the union to include mutual consent. There, the bargaining process led to this euphemistic phrase, the rubber room, which New York City teachers who can't find jobs as a result of mutual consent are guaranteed jobs, and New York City is now spending about $130 million a year paying for teachers who are sitting in rooms but not teaching. So that was the cost of getting to mutual consent, but I think Chancellor Klein felt so strongly, for the reasons Scott's outlined, that was crucial to his theory of reform that it seemed a price worth paying.
In DC, as you'll see, we're able to avoid that. If you're if you lose your position at your school because of mutual consent as a teacher, and you aren't able to find a position at another school, you have a full year of salary if you are rated as effective or highly effective. If you weren't rated as effective, you have 90 days. And then at the end of that point, you're terminated from your role with the district because you're not working, which is what seems to make sense. The other thing I'll mention here is, how do we negotiate this with a big pay raise? As usual, it was a 21% across the board pay raise for teachers over a 5-year period. That, as is typical in these sorts of negotiations, is how we got the union to agree to mutual consent and also to providing for performance pay. So no great secrets or negotiating art here. So as Jim mentioned, I'll talk.
Could I just add one comment?
Please.
Very quickly. I'm quite close to my local principal at my daughter's school in the north of DC. And she mentioned to me that the system is working very nicely for effective or highly effective, but nevertheless there can be differences of opinions between the teachers, strong differences between that and the principal's opinion about how the school should be run.
Sure.
And in that case, she said she's had to have a couple of difficult conversations with teachers and said, what are we going to do here? And she kind of invites them to leave for that reason. So it's not a question necessarily of effectiveness, but kind of policy direction.
That's exactly right. And I think that speaks to the point also that a lot of this is just good management. Not all personnel decisions about where people are working or how the schools run need to be made through these formal sorts of processes. To a large extent, what we're talking about here is sort of the fallback when in dealing with persistent situations where you have persistently low-performing teachers who don't want to find a different job, who instead are intent on outlasting the principal, or and these are a relatively small percentage of teachers, as we'll see in some of the data. To dive a bit into the structure of the system, and we'll go through this relatively quickly, and then are happy to have any of you interrupt with questions if anything is unclear, or we can return to it in the discussion. This slide situates our evaluation system as part of a broader human capital theory of action. Evaluation alone isn't meant to stand on its own as an independent lever for driving improvements in teacher quality and student achievement. Instead, it sits in this sort of middle of this theory of action. So as you can see on the left side, we start off by investing in recruiting and selecting the best teachers we can to come into the system. That's a large investment we've made over the past 10 years, significantly increased the size of our recruitment team, our advertising, our headhunting for teachers. Supporting new hires is a key aspect of the program, so setting up new hires for success. And then you'll see the evaluation piece sits at the middle, and it sits there because it enables us to differentiate the ways in which we treat teachers at different points of the performance distribution. It enables us to have a consistent, standardized way of identifying the best teachers in the district, whom we want to make sure we're retaining, providing with leadership opportunities to expand their reach. It gives us some data to know how to support teachers who are in the middle of the distribution, and then it helps us identify our comparatively small percentage of truly ineffective teachers. Small percentage, but they have an outsized influence on student outcomes, and have a fair, transparent, equitable way of moving them out of the system. What I'll mention here is that impact is most commonly associated with teacher evaluation. It actually is 25, I think at this point, 27 different evaluation systems for every single different type of school-based staff member. Unlike some districts in the country, we decided that if we were going to raise the bar for performance among our teachers, it was only fair to do so for all other school-based staff members. So we actually have individualized, tailored evaluation systems for everyone from the principal to the custodians, social workers, counselors, front office, desk assistants, clerks, business managers. Anyone who works in a school has a tailored evaluation system that is structurally the same in terms of it's annual, involves multiple assessments, involves a clear set of standards, but has tailored components based on that person's job. So what a custodian's being assessed on obviously is quite different, completely different from what a teacher's being assessed on.
Can I just quickly add a background question? You mentioned there's a package of reform, not just on evaluation, right? You have selection of teachers,
Sure.
teacher support, and other incentives, whatever. But mostly what we heard in the last 10 years from DC is about the evaluation. Can you give a sense of how large is the evaluation piece vis-a-vis the other packages in the teachers area?
So it certainly is the most controversial piece, which is why I think it's what you read in the paper. It's more controversial and so more interesting to talk about and write newspaper stories about than we're providing coaching and support and training for teachers or we're recruiting teachers. I think Jim can probably speak in a more quantitative way than I can to exactly the comparative impacts of these different sorts of levers. But I think what we have seen and what Jim and his colleagues' research suggests is that being able to implement a system like this that moves out your lowest performing teachers and also improves the performance, creates incentives to improve the performance of teachers at the high and low end of the spectrum, has a comparatively very large effect on teacher practice and student outcomes compared with some of these other levers. For instance, we've invested quite a bit in trying to figure out how we can better retain our high-performing teachers. But it turns out we have been retaining about 92% of our highly effective teachers at the highest performance category for the past number of years. There's just not that much we can squeeze in terms of gains by trying to improve that by a percentage point or two. Because most of those 8% who are leaving the classroom are leaving for reasons that are outside of our control. They're moving out of the city. For family reasons, they want to move back home. They've gotten married. They're going back to graduate school. They don't actually like teaching very much and want to pursue a career change. There's some percentage of teachers who are leaving and going to teach at a charter school or a school in Virginia, but our ability to affect that and then the effect size of the retention work is just not as high as some other things, as an example. Anything you would add, Jim, or should we wait for the results?
Yeah, why don't we come back to that? Because I think I will talk about that when we talk about the results a little bit, but it's a great question.
So to quickly walk through the structure of impact, and all of these guidebooks are available online. The easiest way to access them is just to Google Impact Guidebooks or DCPS Impact. You can find all of them. Every group, so general ed teachers, special education teachers who are working with students with high needs, educational aides, every other type of group has a set of unique components. You can see some groups have more components, some have fewer. They all constitute these sorts of pies so that you can see exactly what percentage of your evaluation is attributable to each component. And another important piece is that each component is assessed multiple times over the course of the year. One of the hallmarks of the system in the past was that teachers wouldn't receive any feedback on their performance at any point in the year until the very end, when principals were required to file these sorts of summary evaluations. In the current system, teachers and all other staff members get feedback on their performance multiple times over the course of the year, so their final evaluation rating should never be a surprise. As I mentioned, every component has a scoring rubric, a set of standards that describe what practice looks like at each of the 4 levels. This is what ineffective practice looks like: minimally effective, effective, highly effective, and so on. And these are quite detailed, as you can see if you access the guidebooks, and they're designed to be as clear and transparent as possible. We'll linger a little bit on the structure of evaluation for teachers, since that tends to be the primary interest. There are a number of different components. The first is individual value added, which is the way in which we look at student achievement. It's value added because it's based on a rather complex regression model that enables us to take into account how much those students in the teacher's classroom grew, and then also account for other factors that might influence that but are outside of the teacher's control. The poverty level of the students, the percentage of students with special needs, who are English language learners, where they started off, those sorts of factors. So the goal is to be able to fairly compare teachers from Northwest Washington, in affluent parts of the city, and far southeast Washington, in much higher poverty parts of the city, and be able to identify which teachers are higher performing by isolating their own contribution to student achievement. We don't only use those big high stakes end of year tests. This is a shift we've made over the years. Instead, we put significant weight, about a third of the evaluation, on those high stakes assessments at the end of the year. But we also have a component for all teachers that we call teacher assessed student achievement data. So this is based on other assessments the teacher gives over the course of the year. Sometimes those are off-the-shelf assessments from companies. We have good assessments for everything from literacy to math, early childhood, etc. Sometimes they're teacher-written assessments. So as a district, we don't have standardized assessment for 12th grade DC history. And so that's oftentimes an assessment the teachers generated themselves. It needs to be verified by the principal, and this is meant to be a collaborative goal-setting process. The teacher and principal sit down at the beginning of the year, they decide which assessments they'll use, what their goals are, so what level of student achievement will be necessary to be awarded a highly effective score, an effective score, and so on. And then at the end of the year, they return to look at the student achievement data and determine what score the teacher merits.
Scott, what can I ask? What do you do for the value added for subjects and grades where there aren't standardized tests?
Yeah, for those subjects, we don't have value added, and value added only is present for 20 to 25% of our teachers.
Given the lack of data.
Given the lack of data, yeah, because we need classes where students took the test the year before, and they're taking the test in the current year. They have to be of a certain size, so the number gets whittled down.
There's no gym teacher value added.
Sadly, no.
Kickball.
Yes. Gym teachers, like all other teachers, have this sort of thing, which will be about physical fitness measures and so on.
So in the case where there isn't value added available, how do you replace the 35%?
The bulk of it is made up for by what we call the essential practices, which are observations of teacher practice. So all teachers have this teacher-assessed student achievement data. It's always at about 15%. It's always that small because these are not standardized assessments. They're not administered in a controlled way. They're often not written in a standardized way. And also, we're aware that it creates a lot of risk of perverse incentives to put, say, 50% of evaluation on an assessment that a teacher is administering, grading themselves. This is not to suggest any lack of ethics on the part of teachers. It's just a hard situation to put people in when stakes are this high. And so instead, we make up for that value-added percentage largely through the observations.
Sorry.
Yes. No,
are teachers who are assessed using a value-added component paid the same as teachers who aren't?
Good question. They're eligible for larger bonuses.
Okay.
Because it does increase the stakes, the amount of pressure, and so on, which is something that could discourage teachers from teaching those grades. Mm-hmm. So that's a piece we've added to the scale to try to balance that. Yeah, good question. So all teachers are assessed on the essential practices, which are an observation rubric that are meant to reflect our vision of the elements of what we think constitute good teaching. These are things that will sound familiar to all of you who work in education and that are probably not terribly different from what good teaching looks like around the world. Are you cultivating a responsive learning community? Are you challenging students with rigorous content? Are you well planned? Are you facilitating effectively? Are you helping push students to higher level understanding? Those sorts of things. These rubrics are available in the same guidebooks I mentioned before. We've continued to iterate them a bit because over the course of 10 years as a district and as a field, we learn more and more about what makes good teaching. With the adoption of Common Core standards in the United States, that prompted a more significant revision of our standards. We try not to change them too much because these are the standards that teachers pay a lot of attention to. They're what lead to these high stakes. But these are the standards that principals and assistant principals are using when they observe teachers. They're also the standards for the first 7 years of the system. We had a cadre of third-party evaluators who are centrally based, who are content-specific, who went into classrooms throughout the district to assess teachers. At a certain point, we phased them out simply because we were 7 years into the program and it made sense to see that there was less of a need for them anymore. But these standards are being used to assess teachers on a regular basis. Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about the political economy of making those changes? Right? Anytime you have a change, I mean, you started out by talking about this massive renegotiation you had to have with the teachers union. I imagine that anytime you change, there was some conflict or some heat. How did you negotiate that?
No, having a health economist here would get questions about political economy. One of the important things to mention about the context in DC is that in a somewhat odd situation, we have a teachers union that has relatively strong collective bargaining rights. However, teacher evaluation doesn't need to be collectively bargained in DC. This was something that Congress in 1996 passed a law that included this provision that exempted evaluation from collective bargaining. Nobody quite seems to know the provenance of this law or that provision. It wasn't utilized until Michelle Rhee came into office and said, wait a minute, this is a significant amount of authority. But that's meant that we've been able to make changes more aggressively, more proactively, without needing to go back to the negotiating table every single time than places with strong unions like New York City or California. It would be hard to do a system like this at all, and also to make those sorts of changes if we had to negotiate them every year. I mean, we negotiated this contract in 2010 and didn't have a new contract again until just earlier this year, because negotiating these things is hard. I think in terms of the politics, we've tried to be, despite not needing to negotiate them, have tried to be really thoughtful. Every year we've engaged in dozens, if not hundreds, of focus groups of teachers, surveys, conversations, and have tried to balance the changes we make. We made a large set of changes 4 years into the program, and one of the things that we did was to sort of raise the bar. So we made it more rigorous. We moved up the standard for what you needed to, the score you needed to be effective. At the same time, we decreased the weight put on value added, because we knew that was something that was causing teachers anxiety. And we made provisions for fewer observations for teachers who had been high performing every year. So I think a lot of it from a policymaking standpoint has been, how can we thoughtfully balance the different components of this system so that we're not breaking the system, putting too much stress on teachers, creating unforeseen consequences.
And was the recent contract negotiation easier, I hope, than the initial one?
I mean, we gave the teachers another big raise in exchange for not much of anything, so I would say it was pretty easy. With a system, an attribute of having mayoral control is that these things do, I think, the political influences funnel directly from the mayor's office. Now, under a school board, the political influences funnel from the interests of your 7 or your 9 or whatever it is school board members. But what it means is that the mayor now has sort of a more direct influence on making decisions like, do we need to agree to a contract? Do we have the money to provide a large raise? Those sorts of things. Just a couple more components. There's a 10% that is part of everyone's evaluation that is called commitment to school community. This is meant to reflect the things that teachers do that are outside of their classroom instruction. So it's things like collaborating with colleagues, contributing to sort of the school's priorities, partnership with families, recognizing that teachers do more things and are expected to do more things than just what happens within the walls of their classroom during class time. And then it's a pretty straightforward mechanical calculation that puts all these things together. Scores multiplied by weights. You'll notice at the bottom there's a core professionalism component. That's meant to just reflect things like, are you coming to work? Do you have a lot of excused absences? Are you frequently tardy? You can only lose points for that. You can't gain points by coming to work. But you can lose points, and that's actually been an important lever, I think, for principals to be able to hold teachers to some standards. And then we've kept alluding to this, but this is what our scale looks like. There are 5 rating categories, and each rating category has a pretty straightforward set of consequences. On the top end, if you're highly effective, 350 to 400 points. On the scale, you're eligible for bonuses of up to $25,000, which is still a lot. Not as much as 250, but a lot of money. On an annual basis, you can also move up the career ladder and get large increases in your base salary. If we look at the left-hand side, if you're ineffective, you're eligible to be dismissed after 1 year. One hallmark of the DC system is that that's the most rapid provision for termination of any system, any public school district system in the country. Charter schools are typically able to operate outside of these things, private schools. But for a school district, being able to terminate teachers after 1 year is extraordinarily rapid and was one of the most controversial parts of the system. As you can imagine, when we rolled this out, there were concerns among teachers, union advocates, and so on, that the goal was to fire half the teachers in the first year. In fact, in the first year, 2% of teachers were rated as ineffective. The percentage has only dropped since then, as you would expect. At this point, we think of teachers who are rated in this category only really as hiring mistakes, right? Because we've moved out the very lowest performing teachers in our 2009 workforce. So it's a comparatively small percentage, but as Jim's research shows, these very lowest performing teachers have an outsized influence. The tails of our distribution of teacher effectiveness are pretty long. And so that means that the teachers at the very bottom are a lot worse than the teachers in the 10th percentile or 15th percentile, for instance.
Could you give us a rough idea of the numbers in each of these groups?
We actually have a slide coming up that'll show you the distribution.
Thank you.
Yep.
One, maybe this is a political economy point. One other point I'll make here is that in doing hundreds of feedback sessions with teachers in the first year of impact, one thing I was struck by is that teachers in almost any school agree with the idea that there is some comparably small proportion of really low performing teachers. There's a lot. That doesn't mean they agree with having an evaluation system like this necessarily. It's not. It wasn't a popular thing in all buildings, but even in conversations with 30 teachers who are upset about the system, we could come to agreement on the idea that there's 1 or 2 teachers in their building, everyone knows who they are. This is probably true of almost any workplace. Folks who are just performing at a really low level and shouldn't be given a year, 2, 3, 4 years to improve. And then you'll see the consequences sort of cascade up from there. If you're minimally effective, you get some more time to improve. If you're developing, even more time, and so on.
And, sorry, Scott, just to clarify, so if 1 year you're developing, next year you could be ineffective, you're out.
Mm-hmm. If you're ineffective in any year, you're out. We have a set of business rules if you're developing and then minimally effective, or minimally effective and developing. But the idea is we're giving you more time if you're closer to being effective.
And are these different for where you are in your career? So is a first-year teacher judged by the same standard?
They are, actually. We obviously find first-year teachers perform at a lower level. Some of Jim's students have done some really interesting research about looking at sort of quintiles of performance starting off, and finding where teachers start off is quite predictive of sort of where they tend to stay. In recent years, the percentage of teachers in the ineffective category has been around 0.5% to 1%, including first-year teachers. So this is still a really rare situation. And if you're starting off at that point, the data suggests you're very unlikely to improve enough to be effective ever. And the effects on student learning of keeping you in the classroom for 3 years or 5 years, as even other new evaluation systems do, are pretty negative for students. Just a couple more things. Compensation has been a centerpiece of this as one of the major other human capital levers that the evaluation system drives. What you'll see here is the lower line in light blue reflects our previous system, and the dark blue line reflects total maximum potential compensation under the new system. You'll see a couple of things here. One is that under the previous system, as in most places, teachers' salaries increased very gradually. The only ways of increasing your salary were simply by staying. Every year you got a small bump, and by gaining additional education. Nothing against people working in academia, but there's a lot of evidence that having a master's degree or a PhD doesn't make you a more effective teacher. And so that was an incentive structure that we wanted to sort of intentionally undermine. And so instead, under the new system, we've increased the slope. So if you're high performing, you're eligible for your salary to increase much more rapidly. We've also raised the ceiling. And these figures include the annual bonuses on top of your base salary. But it means that a teacher in DCPS in a high-needs school can earn as much as $131,000 in a given year, which is a dramatic increase, but necessary for attracting and keeping good teachers in an expensive place like DC.
One question. So this is a lot of money. Where did it come from so quickly?
The mayor. I mean, one of the things that has been really interesting, I'll mention a couple of things about this. One is that we when we launched these, made an intentional decision that we were willing to see average teacher salaries increase because we thought that the effects of this kind of system on performance would make up for that. A lot of that calculation was based on just the data suggesting that the effects of teacher quality outweigh those of things like class size. So we thought even if we're seeing a slight increase in class size because we have slightly fewer teachers, because every teacher is more expensive, we'll have much more effective teachers. As it's turned out, the district's grown in enrollment and funding and so on, so we actually haven't needed to see that, but that was an intentional weighing of potential consequences we made from the beginning. The other is we actually haven't seen average teacher salary increase that much over the course of this time. What we had in the prior to impact system was a lot of veteran teachers who were high paid and weren't actually high performing. A lot of those teachers either were exited through impact, decided to retire voluntarily, left voluntarily. And so the increases in high performing teacher salaries actually were, to a large extent in the first number of years, outweighed, made up for, compensated for by retirements, exits, etc. of your highest performing teachers, your highest paid teachers who were veteran teachers and weren't necessarily the highest performing. I want to get it back to Jim quickly. This is a bit more detail on the bonus structure. You're eligible for a larger bonus, a dramatically larger bonus if you teach in a high poverty school. Of course, if you teach in Group 1, which is our value-added group, if you're in one of our highest poverty schools, and so on. The base salary increases are sort of grafted on top of our traditional salary schedule, so we didn't completely move away from the traditional, what we call steps and lanes, but we sort of place chutes and ladders on it, if you will, based on the performance. And there we go. This reflects one of the changes. I don't know that we need to linger on this, but a change that we made that I mentioned. This was the change we made for year 4, where we increased the rigor of the system. Basically, we were looking at our data in year 3 and saying, wait a minute, we're getting back to a point where 90% of teachers are effective or highly effective, because that's what happens. Ratings drift up. Everyone wants to feel like everyone's improving. And so we made the system more rigorous at that point, but also compensated for it in some other ways. And now Jim is going to speak a bit about the effects of impact.
Sure. Before I start, does anybody have a question about any of the design aspects?
In terms of data collection, when you say we, you mean University of Virginia, which team that goes out to collect those data? I mean, some of them are very obvious, standardized tests, but some can be very subjective.
Yeah.
Classroom observation, essential practices. Who are the team that go out to collect such data? How do you train them to make sure they're consistent?
Yeah, great question. So it's actually not University of Virginia. This is all, we had to build a quite significant central infrastructure in our central offices in order to make all of this happen. Because as you point out, none of this is easy. And it's who's conducting observations. So for the first 7 years, we had a cadre of about 40 trained, experienced teachers who spent 6 weeks over the summer learning, norming, being trained via videos, having their reliability monitored via norming assessments, who would go out and observe teachers in classrooms. Teachers are also observed by their school-based leaders. We have an operations team of about 10 people who do everything from maintaining the database into which all of this is entered to calculating scores, responding to appeals and complaints, processing those in a fair way, conducting trainings. It was an investment that was quite significant, but I think is also one of the things that differentiates the DC system from systems in many other places that were launched over the last 10 years and didn't make that kind of an investment, and so found that, well, on paper, the system looked quite similar to ours. In execution, they fell down on the implementation side.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point, and we'll come back to the implementation. We have a few slides that sort of describe that. I want to talk a little bit about the effects of this system, but before I get started, I just want to mention two things that I've been impressed with over the last 7 years, having worked with Scott, and you've gotten a flavor for this. The design, the thought that went into the design of the system was at the cutting edge of what we knew about how to assess teachers at that time, and I think the system has continued to adapt to new knowledge in the field over time. And so this was an incredibly thoughtful design that wasn't just premised on the notion that if we hold out a financial incentive in front of teachers and tell them if they raise their student test scores, they'll get this big raise. And for those of you that keep up with that literature, you know that while that's been tried in many places in this country, it's been universally unsuccessful, right? Teachers do not respond in that way. The underlying premise, of course, of that theory is that teachers were shirking their responsibilities, right? That they were lazy, they weren't working as hard as they could, as opposed to the theory that I think underlined the DCPS theory of action, which was teachers may not understand how to be better teachers, and we want to provide them incentives to be better teachers, but we also want to provide them with the supports that help them get there. And so I think that's an important differentiation. And as Tom D., who is my collaborator on the sort of evaluation side of this, and I describe when we present these results to audiences, we believe, although we don't have a ton of evidence to support this statement, that is the significant differentiation between why you're finding results in DC and why you fail to find results in many of these other places in the U.S. So I'll quickly go through a little bit of what we've done on the research side, and it's been, I will say, greatly aided by the description of the data collection that Scott just described. Any of the data that's connected to impact, we have found to be impeccable. It gets transferred to us. We do a lot of data checking to make sure that it's consistent and reliable. There are data that we need that come from outside the impact system, and I would say impeccable may not be the description I would use. And so we've spent a lot of time on those data elements, trying to get them to the point where we feel comfortable that they're reliable and up to the task. This gives you a sense of 5 different papers that we've written over the last 6 years. We spent the first year and a half working with Scott just building a database, right? So this didn't start off year one, let's do some data analysis. And so it was about 2013 before we had that first paper that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But since then, we've done additional work, and we were in DC last week meeting with Scott and his colleagues at DCPS, and there's probably another 8 projects that I could have listed here that we're in the process of doing with them. So I'm going to talk about the first 2 of these, and they largely operate off the first 3 years of impacts design. And so Scott just showed you that slide, and I'll come back to a version of it in a second that describes this. For us, we wanted to build a database that allowed us to do lots of different analyses. I will say we've probably had 4 or 5 students now who've written dissertations, and Scott alluded to this, off of the DC data, and they've done a lot of interesting work in addition to the work that Tom and I have been part of. And sort of 2 things that sort of drove the way we approached this work. One, we wanted to make sure that the data we were using was of very high quality. We didn't want to invest a lot of time and effort and provide feedback to Scott and his colleagues at DCPS that was inaccurate. And the other thing we wanted to be careful about was using rigorous research methods, because in the end, we wanted to understand, did impact cause outcomes for teachers and students to improve? And that causal statement, as many of you know, is a high bar to get over. I'm happy to talk in more detail about how we feel we've gotten over that bar. the two figures on this page give you some sense that at least for a couple of these papers, we've been using regression discontinuity, which is arguably, if you've met all the requirements of the method, arguably a causal method. And so that's the approach that we've taken in a couple of these papers. In a couple of other papers, we weren't able to leverage that kind of methodology, and so we're using a method called differences in differences, a weaker causal statement, but one where we've done a lot of checking to make sure we feel comfortable with it. So this gets back to the question that was asked about the distribution of teachers. That graph, this is the first 3 years of impact, where we had only 4 rating categories, and you see how teachers over that 3-year period were average. To Scott's point, relatively few teachers were, even in that period, rated ineffective. Many more were rated minimally effective, where, if you recall, you were given 1 year to get better, and if you weren't better, that is, moving to at least the effective category at the end of that second year, you could be dismissed. And Scott said could be, it's almost the case that, and I can show you the first stage on these RDs, it's almost always the case that teachers who are rated in a category, if they're rated ineffective, they get dismissed. There are appeals, but those appeals are rarely granted. And Scott can probably speak to more of the details. And so I'm going to focus in the analysis that I show you on 2 of the thresholds, because it is these rating category thresholds and the different incentives that those different rating categories provide that create the regression discontinuity. So if you're a minimally effective teacher, just to the left of that 250 impact score, you got a really strong incentive to get better, right? Because if you don't, within 1 year, you will be fired. So we leverage that to try to understand, did people get better? The other incentive that Scott's already mentioned is the one between the effective and the highly effective teachers. You become highly effective, you're now eligible for very large bonuses and very large increases in base pay. The base pay increases, the present value of the base pay increases associated with being twice highly effective, which is what you need to have in that period in order to get that base pay increase, are on the order of $200,000. So a very meaningful, that's the present value of that lifetime increase. So again, the DCPS has invested lots of resources, and I think appropriately so. And then the other thing that Scott alluded to, this is a system that is premised on the kids, right? It is, so for example, if we move to this, the change that occurred under what I think the DCPS people call Impact 3.0, and you see how that distribution has shifted. Part of that shift, Scott sort of alluded to, may be the result of just increases in the way teachers are being evaluated. Some of it certainly reflects real improvements in the teachers, right? Teachers who got better, teachers who weren't going to get better who left. And so that whole distribution has shifted to the right. And I think one of the arguments for introducing the developing category, that is dividing that effective category in half, was that we aren't doing enough to improve outcomes for kids. We need to send a signal to those lowest performing effective teachers that they have to do better. So those developing teachers are given 2 years to get better. If they don't, they then can be terminated. So the basic idea behind some of the results I'm going to show you is this sort of notion of the differential incentives in the rating categories in that top graph, because those were the first years. We've just completed a paper that we shared some of the results with Scott and his team last week, where we've done the same kind of RD work for the last 3 years that we have data for, that is this Impact 3.0, and I can sort of give you a summary of those. So if we're sitting back here and you think about what the incentives are to a minimally effective teacher, you can imagine that some of those teachers say, yep, I'm going to get better, and I'm going to use the supports that the system provides to figure out how I'm going to get better, and I'm going to figure out a way to get across that 250 impact score threshold point. Other teachers might say, I've been working pretty hard at this. I'm not sure I can get better. So one of the other things that we wanted to look for was differential retention. And so I'm happy to go into more detail, but the basic idea is you're comparing teachers to the left of that threshold with teachers just to the right of that minimally effective threshold to see whether there are differential performances, either in terms of retention or in terms of improvement. Okay, happy to go into more of the intuition behind the RD, but that's the basic idea. And here's what we found.
Sorry, and then when you think about retention there, you, of course, don't look at the mechanics of the system.
Yeah, so the minimally effective people, you're saying, you just got this minimally effective rating, you have 1 year to get better. Do those people not even come back for that second year?
Oh, right.
So this is not a mechanical exit, it is a voluntary exit. So great point, thank you. And so here's what we found, that you see, of those people who are minimally effective, their attrition rate went up 50% once they received that first time minimally effective score. And this is relative to the people who didn't get that message, who looked arguably the same, right? They had very similar impact scores just to the right of that threshold. This is relative to that. So you're seeing very large attrition, and I'll come back and show you in a minute, that attrition redounds to the benefits of kids in a big way.
That's in a year and a half. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, teachers see the scores that they get, right? So they have a clear indication of where they are. Okay.
Yeah.
What I was just going to say is, this is over a period of 18 months, or the minimally effective have 2 years to get better, or
during this time period, they have 1 year. 1 year. You get the rating in the summer. After that year, you get a rating, and the people who got that rating were 50% more likely not to show up in September.
In the fall.
Yes.
Wow.
Did you do a little research, I'm sure you did, into the age of those teachers or their seniority?
Yeah, in this period, as Scott sort of alluded, these people were coming from across the distribution because this was the first 3 years of impact. And while you do see, on average, experienced teachers perform better, during this period there were still a fair number of experienced teachers who were not performing well.
One thing I'll mention here is just one characteristic of the labor force in DC, and you all live here or know something about it, is that there are lots of other places you can teach if you want to. So we're surrounded by large suburban Maryland, Virginia, there are charter schools, there are private schools. So I think it's a different context, and having some international conversations or just in rural areas in the United States, for instance, it's different from a context where you have to stay in that district because there are no alternatives. And I think that's one of the interesting and sort of important characteristics to mention about this sort of a finding.
Are you able to replace the teachers?
We'll get to that, because that is what we're headed.
That's a key question, though, because if we couldn't, right, if the replacements were really low, then that would be a problem.
What about the teacher who have to leave? Can they work elsewhere, or that's it? It's going to have an impact on their career?
There are no national databases sharing anything along these lines, and so I think, yes, if you've taught somewhere for 15 years and then you get this low score, those teachers often were able to find jobs in Maryland, Virginia, private schools.
Two questions, if I may. So one, it seems to me that the average performance also is improving over time. So that's a very good way of keeping teachers motivated. But the other thing, it seems to me that as the system gets known about teachers, also you are getting better teachers every year, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, the incoming teachers, yes.
They are different than the ones
that
are. Okay.
So do you still have ineffective teachers, or you keep raising the benchmark?
I wouldn't say we've kept raising it. I mean, at this point, really, the only ineffective teachers should be teachers who are newly hired, right, new to the district. Because if you shouldn't have been teaching here for 10 years, being ineffective, you would have been terminated in the early years of impact, and that's what we're seeing for the most part.
Well, one quick comment. I worked in a large private school in Maryland, and we actually had teachers come to the school and take a pay cut because they wanted to avoid all the evaluation.
Right.
Whether they were ineffective or not, they were generally effective from what I saw, but didn't see them all. So it was just...
Yeah, I think that this is a system, and the data that DCPS has, there are a certain number of teachers who just find this so stressful. Even if they're good, it's a stressful system, right? And they'll prefer to work other places. This gets to an interesting question, I think, in education, where the theory is that certain teachers perform much better in an incentive-based system. Other teachers prefer, it gets to the notion of risk aversion and all the rest of it. So I think there's a certain amount of sorting that went on in terms of DCPS teachers over time. Yeah.
And it's not the right system for everywhere. I wouldn't suggest that every district should implement a system like this.
Yeah, very interesting. One guy came from Virginia, and he was sick and tired of having to go to meetings to get his professional development points to show that he was improving teacher. He said it was a waste of time. And he just refused and moved out of that system. Yeah. So there's all sorts of reasons why people do leave, but fortunately for good reasons here.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. The other thing that we observed here, using the RD analysis, was that those minimally effective teachers who remained improved on their impact scores on average by about 12.6%. So that's about half the gains that a typical novice teacher makes in her first 3 years of teaching. This is about 25% of a standard deviation of impact scores. So I wouldn't say it's huge, but the notion that you can get improvement on teaching skills is not something you find in most professional development settings, for example. The professional development literature is not replete with interventions at scale where you observe improvements on the order of this magnitude.
So, just to be clear, so that's those who chose to remain.
Yep.
That's not what the average score was. I'm just trying to make sure that you're seeing that those who remain, that was their improvement.
That was their improvement relative to the people who didn't face the same incentive, right? So the effective teachers who look in terms of their impact scores, they were just to the right of that threshold, look very much like them. The minimally effective teachers improved by about a quarter of a standard deviation more than those teachers.
Can I make just an announcement for people who are following by WebEx or audio? If you have any question, just please send it through the system and then we can ask that. Thank you.
So the other thing I'll highlight here is that when we looked at the threshold between effective and highly effective teachers, so people who were highly effective for the first time, you get a bonus when you're highly effective for the first time, but you don't get the base pay. You didn't get the base pay increase then. So once highly effective teachers, what their incentive, of course, is to be highly effective again. And so what you observe here is about an 11 impact point improvement of those people who were once highly effective relative to the people who were otherwise highly effective. Okay, so again, it appears in both these instances that teachers are responding to these incentives in the ways you would hope they would. They're improving their teaching skills, and poorer teachers are leaving. So this gets to the question that was raised a minute ago. This is the average impact scores of teachers who exit and teachers who enter the DC system in each of those years. And so you see by 2013 that difference is about 37% of a standard deviation of impact scores. So a really big difference. So this, I think, is, as Scott suggested, this is a really important aspect of the labor market that DCPS is able to draw on. There seems to be an almost endless supply, partly for the reasons that, the way they've designed impact, and partly because of just the district, right? It is a place where lots of young people, I'm preaching to the choir here. So this is what leverages a lot of this improvement, that they're able to exit people and bring in people who on average just start out a lot better. And I'm going to show you some analysis we did that documents this a little more rigorously in a causal way. So we wrote a paper where we didn't spell teacher with 2 R's. It must have been one of the reviewers caught that. So the basic idea of this paper was we wanted to look for every teacher who left DCPS, exited the system, and then we saw that person leave. We saw a new person come in and take that person's job. We wanted to try to understand what happened to the achievement of the kids in those classrooms. Did achievement change? And for those of you that follow the teacher labor market literature closely, you know that on average, when teacher turnover occurs, you usually expect a decline in student achievement. This is just a thing that happens on average. Certainly some classrooms improve, others get worse by a lot, but on average, it's about 8% of a standard deviation of student achievement. So that was the basic idea. We wanted to compare the difference in student performance in those classrooms where teachers changed compared to classrooms where they didn't change. And so that was the sort of comparison group, the classrooms for which the teachers remained. So I can go into all the sort of details if you like, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things here. So one of the things is that when high-performing teachers leave, you expect achievement to go down. You lose a high-performing teacher, that's a tough person to replace. On average, what we see is that, at least in terms of student achievement, which is the DCPS, which was the standardized achievement test that was used during this period, you do see decreases, but none of those are statistically significant. What you do see is that when a highly effective teacher, a high-performing teacher, leaves a high-poverty school in DC, that their impact scores go down. That is, a new teacher coming in will have about a 40-point lower impact score. I don't think that should be a surprise to anybody. That losing high-performing teachers doesn't occur all that often, as Scott has alluded. The results on the right to me are I was just sort of shocked. I have to tell you that graduate students wear themselves out double-checking all this. So what you see is that when a low-performing teacher, and here we mean either an ineffective teacher or a minimally effective teacher, when either of those kinds of teacher leaves a high-poverty classroom, and this the next person on average who walks into that classroom, that is over a 20% of a standard deviation increase in student achievement. That's huge. I mean, again, you guys, probably most of you understand this. The black-white achievement gap in this country is about 80% of a standard deviation, right? So this is a quarter of that. And we can use other it's about 4 months of learning. The average classroom, 20% of a standard deviation is about 4 months of learning during a year. So this gets back to a more rigorous way to assess the graph we just saw, that the entering teachers are, on average, quite good, and that losing these low-performing teachers is an important thing in terms of student achievement. Same thing for reading, a somewhat smaller effect, but that, in terms of student achievement, that's still about 4 months of learning in terms of reading. So this slide I'll skip over. This just summarizes what I've already told you. I will say that we've repeated that first analysis that I just showed you, the RD analysis. We just got done repeating that, and the idea was, do you really think that the kind of system they've implemented can sustain itself over an extended period of time? The RD the results we got were almost identical to what I just showed you. That is, you still got minimally effective teachers having a much disproportionate likelihood of leaving, and you also see positive improvements in the ones who remain. So my sense is we've got about 15 minutes left.
Yes, because we started 10 minutes late, so we were going to overrun by 5 minutes, if it's okay with people. Yes, so 15 minutes. Yeah.
I guess, Scott, I'm happy to play this however you or everybody else in the room wants. I will say that DC has done an extraordinary job of implementing, and you've gotten a feel for this already. And Scott, maybe you can hit on a couple of highlights, but I guess maybe we want to leave time for have more of a discussion here.
This is just this next slide is a nice. It speaks to a point that was raised earlier, which again just is a difference between the system as we implemented it in DC and in most places, investing in hiring staff, in operating costs, to in hundreds of hours of trainings, and I think that is more so than there are a couple of design policy decisions that are really important. For instance, having a relatively high bar for effectiveness, having a relatively expeditious way of moving out low performers. I don't want to underplay the significance of some of those policy and design decisions, but I think the biggest difference has been the implementation investment.
Can you explain a little bit? I don't quite understand some of the supports that you're saying. So that you're saying that teachers were offered training, or how did they become eligible for their trainings, or what were the supports that were given to teachers to help move them across certain thresholds?
I think we may have here's some of the feedback, and I think there's the Essential Practices video library is a slide we have as well, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, I would say at a high level, there are a lot of different things we've done in the last 10 years to try to help teachers improve. I don't know that any of them have been the sort of silver bullet or magic. We don't have the same kind of evidence that Jim just presented for impact. We don't have that kind of evidence about our teacher improvement efforts. And over the 9 years that I've been doing this work, every few years we've changed our approach to teacher development. I do think we can probably say a couple of things. One is that the high stakes of impact have created an incentive for teachers to invest in trying to improve, especially at the sort of low and high thresholds. We have good evidence about that. I think it's also in a more anecdotal, qualitative sense, teachers, school leaders, principals, coaches, there's a lot more sort of focus on improving instructionally now than there was prior to impact, because there's been more attention focused on it, because we have a clear set of expectations, because we've invested in some of these supports. But I think it's still a nut that we're kind of trying to crack. We launched a new system for teacher professional learning a couple of years ago that has been a very different approach, and we're partnering with Jim and some of his colleagues to try to look at, do we have clear evidence that this has resulted in teacher improvement?
Yes.
So I have a couple of questions. I'm trying to figure out which ones to ask. First is, do you find that there's a correlation within schools on performance levels? So to what extent does a school with a principal who has a high impact score is it also able to attract high performing teachers? So, what does the whole school look like in terms, or are they normally distributed within schools? And then the second question is on the individual components that make up the impact score. Is there one that is more highly predictive than the others, or do they all go together? If we can't collect all 5 pieces of data, are there a couple that you think would tell the same story?
Sure. So on the first question, I think another way of approaching your question is to talk about the variation across teachers and impact scores within schools as opposed to across schools. And I think you still, while there is, you do see this clustering that you sort of suggested, there's still a lot of within school variation. You see some very high performing and very low performing teachers in the same school. To the second question, the best way for me to answer that is to say that each of those components are positively correlated at about the 0.3, 0.5 level with value added when we have scores for a teacher who has scores for both, which is about what you see. I mean, that's about as good as it gets, to be honest, in the teacher evaluation literature in this country, that the correlations between the observation rubric and the value added are usually 0.2 to 0.3, and in DCPS, they tend towards the higher end of that range. Some places higher and some other ways. So it's hard for me to say. I think Scott might disagree with this. My sense of another reason that you might want to have value added is that it's a way of holding the in those schools, which many schools have teachers with both value added and teacher observations. All elementary schools do. All middle schools do. And so it is a way for principals to sort of also benchmark their observation scores. If you end up with widely differing outcomes on the observations and the value added, it raises the question, why is that happening? And so I suspect, but I don't have evidence to support the fact that if you didn't have value added in those situations, those scores might drift up a lot more quickly.
Well, and we've seen in some other systems implemented around the country that a system will look very similar to impact on paper, and yet the results will come back and 98% of teachers will be effective or highly effective. Oftentimes systems that are fully based on observations and other sort of school leader assessed metrics. And so I think, our sense is that things like value added and also having these third-party evaluators for the first 7 years of the system sort of played both explicit and implicit roles in lowering and sort of rationalizing scores, right? They actually, mechanically helped to bring scores down, but also implicitly, principals were well aware that, if they were rating all of their teachers at a very high level and master educators or value added or other results suggested that teachers were performing at that level, that would result in a conversation and some scrutiny. The other thing I would add to Jim's response to the first question around school leaders is that in our exit survey results, for instance, we see far and away the most common reason high-performing teachers cite for leaving a school is the school leadership. And that makes sense. I mean, that's probably true of any workplace. And so I think we have, over the past 10 years, increasingly focused our efforts and investments in directly supporting the quality of school leaders, as well as doing that support for teachers, because it's simply hard to get beyond a certain point in terms of school performance without great school leaders as well.
Alonso?
Yeah. My question is hoping you can, even speculate about what do we make of this for general lessons, right? So you're here at the World Bank, and my sense is that given the particular conditions of the DC system and the context where you have a relatively, perhaps, what I would call sort of open door sorting, where, the good, you can attract from relatively close areas, good teachers from Virginia or Maryland or other private schools to this, incentive system, as well as, not create an undue burden for the really bad apples, if we want to put it in that way, to find another place relatively easy and not create upheaval politically too much, perhaps. That probably is not the case in the U.S. and probably is, not the case in many of the countries we work in. So my question is, is it such that the conditions in DC are so particular that we can't really extract some of the really exciting results and the lessons that you've gotten from this impact program to other places? So what can we generalize in terms of trying to adopt some of these policies in other contexts that are different?
Do you want to start, Jim? Well, hey, you said you work in Mexico. Or you do some work in Mexico.
Oh, I'm Mexican. I work in Nicaragua, Colombia, Mexico, Lebanon. Yeah.
I'm going to say I was in Mexico City 4 or 5 years ago and doing a presentation about this to the secretary. Yes. And meanwhile, walking outside, there were tent cities full of teachers striking. It was national strikes at some point. And sort of similar things. Yeah.
Yes.
So what do you think, Jim?
That was your answer?
I'm buying myself time.
Okay. So I think that the things that economists in particular are totally taken with, if we design it right, it'll work or it won't work. But we figure out whether it works. We just design it, and if it doesn't work, fine, it was a bad idea. And I think the lesson that I've come away from having worked with Scott and his team for the last 7 years on, and as Scott said this, I mean, there are lots of places as a result of Race to the Top, a teacher incentive fund. I mean, almost every state in this country has a version of something that looks like impact. The difference is how they implemented it. To me, this is implementation all day long. And it's about not just imposing an accountability system, which is one version of impact, right? It holds teachers accountable. It's about how you create conversations in schools, about the way we're going to improve our outcomes. It's about, and this is the focus on leadership that Scott mentioned. And so My sense is that this is much more about having a system that seems fair and making it reliably applied so that if you work in school A, you're not going to get a different answer for the same performance than if you work in school B. But that we spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, teacher's not performing as well as we would like. How can we help that occur? And we skipped over some slides, but there's a whole video library at DCPS where if you're coming up short on, and Scott can speak to this much better than I can, but if you're coming up on a particular teaching skill in not demonstrating that you have command over that, you can look at videos of how teachers are doing that, and you have coaches who are giving you feedback. Every time you have one of these observations within 2 weeks, you're getting feedback about what that person observed in that classroom. I would say that does not occur in the vast majority of every other school district in this country. I mean, certainly there are exceptions, but to me, this is much more about implementation and the things that would fall in that column under implementation than it is about the design itself, right?
So I'll just add one thing because I think the implementation is one big takeaway. I think another really interesting reflection is on the value of sort of persistence in a policy. It's been 9 years now. I mean, one of the findings, I don't think Jim mentioned this, but one of the really interesting results they found is that they didn't find any effects of impact after the first year. Because a lot of these are incentive effects, right? Like, are teachers incentivized to improve, to leave if they're on, to stay? And after 1 year of a policy, people don't know, is it going to stick around? Will be another policy that changed after 1 year, et cetera. They found the big effect starting after year 2 and thereafter. Also, we've been able to do this now for a number of years through 3 mayoral administrations. It hasn't been without consequences. There's a compelling argument that Mayor Fenty, who appointed Michelle Rhee and started this, lost his re-election in large part because of the controversies. Not just this one, not just impact, but impact was a big part of the campaign dialogue and discourse in 2010. I think it's really to his successor, Vincent Gray's credit, that he kept the policy going, despite having to some extent run against it, because he thought it was best for kids and was compelled by Michelle's successor, Kaya Henderson, who was chancellor until about a year ago. Kept it going, and it wasn't a big issue in the next election. And I think that just speaks to, controversies emerged, and I'm sure this is different in every context, but probably similar. Controversies emerged and rarely sustained for 5 years. I did 100+ focus groups the first year of impact. In cities throughout, in schools throughout the city. There was a lot of anger, emotion, vitriol, etc. There's not now. It's just part of the system. To a point you raised, to some extent, people have self-selected. If you don't want to teach into the system, you teach elsewhere. And then we have some people who have come to DCPS and said, I came here because I was tired of teaching in systems alongside persistently low performers who had no consequences. And I think that speaks to, it is worth enduring this kind of controversy, persisting, implementing it at this level of fidelity and so on, because we have evidence now. At that point, we just had intuition. Now we have evidence that it's made a big difference for students. This is the kind of policy worth investing this kind of, but it's been a big investment of political capital.
So there are several questions from the WebEx. So let me just put a couple, and then we ask for the final. So I'll give the 2 questions and then gather them. So the first one is that don't the impact evaluation reflect the combination of the evaluation incentives in the system and professional development support? So that's one. And the other one is that how the estimated effects using the regression discontinuity relate to impacts that might be found for the system as a whole, taking into account that the fact that the RD estimates are known to only provide rigorous evidence to those near the cut points. So that's the second question. And the third one, let me just throw a third one from outside. Without external experts doing the classroom observation, how do you assure consistency across schools? So those are the 3 questions. And let me just gather last questions from here. There are more?
Yeah.
Oh, there are many. So let's do those 3.
Yeah, and I may ask you to repeat the first one.
Yes.
But So it is entirely accurate that the RD estimates only reflect the effects at those thresholds and say nothing about the effects that occur away from those thresholds, right, or for the system as a whole. We have tried to get our arms around estimating effects for the system as a whole, trying to do a difference in differences type approach where we compare what happened in DC with, and this is where we kind of had problems with what? What do you compare DC to? We've tried Baltimore. We've tried Prince George's County. We've tried NAEP scores for multiple. We've tried a bunch of things, and we don't feel comfortable enough with the results to be sharing them publicly. None of them reflect negatively on DCPS, I will say. It's just that we have methodological concerns about coming up with an appropriate comparison group in terms of trying to get at those broader effects of the RD, or excuse me, of what's happened in DCPS. What was the first one again?
Oh, the first question is whether the impact evaluation, the impact results show a combination of evaluation instead of.
And we cannot. That's absolutely true. I will say, however, the only thing that differentiates teachers to the left of that threshold from teachers to the right is the incentive they face. They're all getting supports. Yeah. They're all getting many of the same things. Is it possible that principals or other focus some of those supports more heavily on teachers to the left than teachers on the right? I think that's possible. We don't know that, but conceptually, at least, supports are available to teachers throughout the distribution. Yeah. Is that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And to the last question, establishing reliability across raters is hard. We've invested a lot in. We have now a pretty state-of-the-art online training and norming system. All school leaders, all people who are assessing teachers have to go through this system and pass through reliability thresholds. They also do it periodically. It's still not the case that everybody's perfectly normed, and I think some systems also have tripped themselves up by letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, by saying we're only going to do this if we can norm school leaders to the extent that we would expect to norm evaluators for a scientific study, and it's just an unrealistic expectation. I think what we've said is we want to invest in this and get to a point at which we feel comfortable, but we can't wait forever. And also, to be frank, the things managers are looking for in different units at the World Bank are probably a bit different. That doesn't mean that it's unfair for managers to assess employees. We see some good amount of sort of self-selection in teachers, highly effective teachers moving from school to school within the system based on principals, management, school leadership, culture, other sorts of factors. I think that's fine.
I guess let me just throw in one other thought related to what Scott just said. I think, as you can imagine, you could always perfect these more. The question is, right now, in the absence of impact, teachers were being evaluated, right? It was just that everybody was effectively evaluated as being quite good because we didn't have a structured evaluation system, right? And so how perfect do you want to make this? I think much of the discussion that we see in the papers is about whether this is fair to teachers or not. No one's raising the question about whether it's fair to kids to have these very low-performing teachers in classrooms. So it is absolutely the case, I believe, that mistakes are made. An effective teacher is judged to be minimally effective and is dismissed from the system. But to me, that is something that I am perfectly willing to accept if the disproportionate gains from this system accrue to the improvement of kids, because nearly all the assessments are done fairly accurately.
Okay, so let me just, because we need to finalize, we have certain things to do now, and so let me just thank Professor Wyckoff and Scott for this fascinating presentation. Given the amount of interest, I think we will invite you again to have another session with us. So it has been really fascinating. And for the people in connecting, the video and presentation will be distributed after the seminar. So let me just ask you for a round of applause.